Right. Hey, everybody. Todd here, and welcome back to another live Wellness Talks question and answer session. So, what I'm going to be doing today is just going over questions related to the topic of the self as context. I've received quite a few questions via my Patreon group and a couple questions in session with folks like, what is this thing? And then, of course, some questions via this YouTube channel and other various ways, email, so on and so forth. So I'll just start off with the very first component of this and just give a blanket statement. What is the self as context? Well, I was thinking about this morning, and one of the easiest ways to play this out is imagine that you could actually, and you do this, I'm sure, all the time, see different scenes of your life from when you were a child, going through junior high, high school, college, the job, your relationships. It just seems like a seamless, endless component. But in actuality, all of these things have happened. They're all of our memories. Yet, there is a component of the self that was there watching this happen, scene after scene after scene after scene. Actually, it's happening right now. So there's part of you right now that's thinking, what's all this about? So there's a voice in your head. And what I mean by that, it's the voice that when I said that, simply said, what voice? There is that thinking mind constantly on, yet there is something aware of that thinking mind. There is something aware of the memory which showed up. There's a present moment and you have a memory, and there's something that's aware of that memory, and that's the self as context. Another way to think about the self as context is just the witnessing self, the observing mind. If we were using DBT titles, it'd be the wise mind. It would be the present moment awareness, situational awareness, or the transcendent self. And there's a lot baked into self as context. But in general, that's the easiest way to think about this. Self as context equals observing mind. Not the thoughts, not the memories, not the sensations. It's the thing that's aware of how you're feeling right now. So go ahead and just take note of that. What am I feeling? Tightness in my legs, tightness in my chest. You're noticing these sensations happening, the stimuli, but something's noticing that. And that's the self as context. So I hope that gives you just a general sense as to what I mean when I say the self as context. And what I'm going to do now is just get into a couple of the questions. Got a few folks that are with me here on Patreon, and then I'll wait for folks to show up here on YouTube as well. But I'm going to just get to those questions since I know that they're watching and waiting. So Jim on Patreon asks, "Hey Todd, can you give us some examples of this?" Well, I think I did that already. But another way of thinking about this too is imagine a timeline, and you've seen these in school, or maybe you've seen these, just putting things in order so we can see the chronological order. And there's a line, and that line runs across, and dropping down from that line would be all these series of events. So you could think of things that are happening to me, what I'm thinking about those things, those same lines, and then that line itself is the self as context. We're moving from one context to the next context to the next context. Another example of this is a video that I have, which is called The Prince and the Beggar. And I love this story because it really does show you kind of like it's the underlying essence of who you are. It's the personal values, especially if you've taken time to really drill down into what those values are. It's the personal values, it's the essence of yourself. And whether you change clothes, as that story goes into, and I'll make sure I leave a link below to direct you to that. But in that story, a prince changes clothing with a beggar wears the clothing of the prince, and yet their essence, their way that they orient to the world doesn't change, and it causes some problems. and causes some opportunities depending on how you look at it. So the context might change, but the underlying component, the values that they hold dear, don't. And that's the self as context as well. So Jim in Patreon asks, hey Todd, could you give us some examples? Oh, all right, that's the one I just read. Sorry about that. So Susan sent a question saying, how is this different than the thinking mind, as I like to point out? Well, basically what it comes down to is the thinking mind is that problem solving component. It's the I'm worried about the future, I'm looking at the past, and the thinking mind, this aspect of yourself. I mean, in all actuality, you have one mind, but it has different components, different parts which show up. And that thinking mind, that processing mind, is looking back at what we did, trying to come up with ways to be informed so that we can improve upon that or just not run into that problem again. And then, of course, thinking mind's looking into the future and it's strategizing and it's planning and it's putting things in place. And we spend a lot of time in both these places. If we spend too much time in the future orientation, we end up with higher levels of anxiety. Now, we can't escape anxiety because that's just part of what it means to be human, is preparing for what's going to happen tomorrow, something as simple as finding food. But if we're there too much, if we start to over worry and try to control all outcomes, which is pretty impossible given the amount of variables that could happen in the universe, that's where anxiety can become an issue. And then if we move to the past and we're focusing too much back here, we want to learn from this. We want to note this information and use this to inform us on how to move. But if we get too hooked, too stuck back here, wishing that we could have done something different, done something in a different way, there's where a lot of the depression components come from. So the self as context is just being back and watching all of this happening, being aware that this process, this minding or thinking mind process is happening. It's not something we can get away from. It would be a terrible idea to get away from it, but there you go. There is another way of thinking about this thinking mind. And if you need to, you can segment it into two: the thinking mind and the observing mind, self as context. So Joseph on Patreon had sent me a message earlier saying, you often talk about rules and tools, and you seem to lump these into a self as context category. Can you expand on this? Sure. So one of the things about self as context and present moment is that they both fall into the awareness section in ACT therapy. There's open, aware, and engaged. And awareness is built up of this self as context and being in this present moment. Mindfulness is kind of all four of these things, which I think I have another question. It gets, well, I'll just answer it now. Diffusion is a openness. Acceptance is an openness skill. And then all four of those put together are the mindfulness practices. It's why mindfulness is such a potent skill to develop, because we're playing around with these four components of engaging and being in the world. And we need them in order to be able to decipher and then move forward in a direction that matters. So a values orientation. So the rules and the tools then, and then anything else which is trying to highlight specific components, processes, mechanics of what it means to be human is important and falls inside of the self as context, because we're noticing that there is this element, this aspect of ourself. So that's why I actually put some of those things, educational type components, into self as context, simply because if we're not aware that those things are there, if we're not aware that those things are driving the bus, so to speak, then we don't know how to do anything about them. How can you change something that you don't even know is running in the background? Things like schemas, things like birth order, like we've noticed that those will have an effect on how we do things. Our identities, where we came from, cultural considerations, all of these things help to build the identity, that persona. Yet self as context is being able to pull back away and see all these amazing, wonderful aspects of what makes our identity, what makes us who we are. So with that being said, I think I've hit on that. Now, Lori on Patreon is asking, so I think I get why it's important, but can you explain how this is useful in your terms in our lives? So yeah, I think I kind of alluded to that a moment ago, but I'll just go back to it. When it comes to self as context, how do I use this in my daily life? Well, first off, knowing or understanding that there is something that's noticing all these different aspects of ourself. It's useful in watching for behaviors that we do. This is why I often will use journaling with a lot of the folks that I work with, and I actually use it myself. I can't always see those thoughts. And if I understand from a self of content in context kind of moment that I won't be able to see these things, and now I'm aware that I can't always see these things, then if I can write them down, then I can put it in place and do something about that. So the journaling component helps me to keep pulling away from seeing the self in context. And that helps me to progress forward. Another way this is useful is that by identifying these different aspects, understanding, for instance, schemas, that there's a mistrust schema, that there's a dependency schema, an entitlement schema, if I'm having difficulties in my life, I can start to notice, which aspect of the self. So being that self as in context, looking at a component that makes up that self, the content of the self, or self as content, then I can ask myself, is this belief, is this rule, is this tool useful in moving in the direction that I'd like to go right now in this moment? So I think I just alluded to it there, so I'll expand on that as well. Self as context, the observing self, helps us to unhook from or get unstuck from self as content, because we have a lot of things that we say about ourselves. I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a psychologist, I'm a doctor, I'm a lumberjack, I'm a bad person, I'm a good person, I am a partier, I like to chill out, I'm an introvert, I'm an extrovert, and the list can go on and on and on. And that's the self as content. Not a bad thing to have. Actually, there's no way we can avoid it. We're going to find these things and identify that way. But if we get too attached, too fused to any one of those things, we're not the self as context, then if we forget about the self as context, then we get stuck inside of that, and it starts to dictate how we're going to respond to things that happen in our life. So self as content versus self as context. What I often try to do, what ACT therapists are all trying to do, is to help you to unhook from this side and slide over to be just in the moment, present, noticing that you're noticing these aspects of yourself, and moving on from there. So Beth on Patreon asks, so how is this different from mindfulness, the present moment activities that I often present? I think I touched on that a moment ago, but self as context. If we're doing a present moment exercise, paying attention to what we're feeling, paying attention to what we're seeing, we're smelling, we're hearing, we're tasting, just getting present to what's going on right now. Part of the mindfulness process is that I am falling back and seeing these components. I'm aware of all this which is happening. I will get back to that in just a second there. So, so how is this different from mindfulness? It's part of mindfulness. So the 4 components in openness and the awareness skills is part of mindfulness. And it's the part which actually allows us to see and understand the processes which are in place. Also, here's a bonus. When we can see these processes, there's not a whole lot we can do to actually change them, especially if we don't know they're there. But going back to answer Laura's question and expand on that a little bit more, if I know those processes are there and I can go in and change those processes, then I can actually change the outcome. And Steve Hayes, one of the founders of ACT, often says you learn it in one, derive it in two, that is, process it, play with it. It falls into the system, into the processes, and it changes what we do. So we may not necessarily be able to alter our automatic responses, but we can go into the processes and alter that. And that'll actually change what we do. And that's part of the premise of the ACT approach, relational frame approach. So the question is like, so the mindfulness really goes into these 4 areas. Can you expand those as well? Yeah, sure. So and that was just coming from something XYX357. So I guess keeping yourself as anonymous as possible, but thanks for the question. When it comes down to those 4 areas, again, openness, awareness, engagement is what I would call the hexaflex, or what it's the ACT framework for the hexaflex approach. And 2 of those components, the openness components, inside of those 3 initial categories, is acceptance. And acceptance is just being willing to experience whatever you're experiencing, sensations, thoughts, memories, emotions. There's a lot of skills to help you to deal with, and there's several of those on this website. And I've actually broken down on my website, on this channel, the 6 different components of ACT, with videos that are there to help you to address just that. So you can actually, after you watch this, go back and look and see that I've actually set out, here are the skills to help you to address these areas. So openness, inside of that, has the acceptance component, and then diffusion, or cognitive diffusion, where that says, if we can give ourselves distance, if we can notice that there's a thought which just keeps coming up, we can push away from the thought, notice that thought. Here's the cool thing then, with self as context, if I know that I have an underlying process, pattern, rule, something that's governing what I do, I can see how this thought connects to that, relates to that, and how it is an automatic response given that something comes at me. So diffusion is just simply noticing your thought, noticing that I'm thinking whatever the thought happens to be. And then the awareness skills, that bigger bucket falls into 2 smaller ones, which is present moment, which is just truly being present to anything that's happening right now. And then the self as context, which is what I've been going through here as well. That's that observing mind, noticing all these components, being completely aware not only of what's happening externally, but what's going on internally, and noticing thoughts and memories and emotions as separate from ourselves. We are objectifying that which we are typically subject to. And then finally, those are the big 4 on this side. When it comes over to the engagement side, we have personal values, and these are the things that give us direction and give us meaning in life. They're the purpose. Why are we here? I love the one question that's been around for a long, long time, and it's simply, what is the meaning of life? And I like how ACT and a lot of the new therapeutic approaches are looking at, it's probably not the best question. It's not what is the meaning of life. That assumes that it resides somewhere outside of you. And a better question to ask yourself would be, well, what is the purpose of life? What's the purpose of my life going to be? So that's what this whole engaged component and the values component of ACT is focused on. And then, of course, committed actions are, well, what can I do that will move me in the direction of the things that I've identified are as important to me, that matter to me? And the cool thing about a committed action is it doesn't need to be, and in fact, it's probably not a good idea to set the bar really high. It's actually better to just follow the principle of small changes. Find something that you know, like you're confident. 1, I'm not confident at all, to 10, totally confident I can pull this off. That you fall somewhere in the 7, 8, or 9, maybe a 10 category. So for instance, I want to lose 40 pounds by December. Okay, that's a pretty lofty goal. And what are your chances, especially if I don't have any smaller steps underneath it? And the value would be health and vitality. That's the direction I want to move in. Being around for my family, not having to deal with medical issues, preventing future suffering. So what I would do in the committed actions is like, well, let's start really, really small. What's something that you could do? How willing are you how confident are you that you would be able to just keep track of a week on, I don't know, on a digital platform, what you ate? Just all you have to do is you don't change anything. Just start doing that. Todd, I think I'm fairly confident. 8, I'm pretty certain I can do that for just 7 days in a row. Awesome. Do it. Experiment. See what happens when you do it. It's a small step moving in the direction of that goal, that larger goal that lines up even further away with the direction of health and vitality and being here, being sustainable, being able to be with your kids, with your grandkids, with your spouse. So, because values aren't goals, it's just the direction. And that's what the whole committed action component is all about. Then falling back into that self as context, again, this becomes highly important because as I look at all these components and I'm observing these things and I'm aware of all these subjects, notice that you're noticing all of this. Just noticing that. That's the self as context. All right, looks like it's come out of the questions that I received online. Of course, if you have questions about this topic, please be sure to go ahead and check out Self as Context playlist, or you can send me a message through that. And you can reach out to me on Wellness Talks, www.wellnesstalks.org, or you can reach me through my website, toddschmenk.com, and multiple ways to reach me. And please keep doing so. And of course, thank you so much to all the folks on Patreon, especially to Jim and Susan and Joseph and Laura and Beth for getting on and giving me a quick question today. I noticed some of you guys had to get off, and that's okay, not a problem at all. And being on Patreon and sending me that, that's awesome. Either way, I'm glad you guys were here, and until the next time, may you be well.